Hi, this is Mr. Fike, and this is my talk on Aristotle's theory of human flourishing. And I'm not going to say anything about Aristotle's life here, maybe at the end if this doesn't go too long. So keep in mind one thing, and that is that for the ancient Greeks, when you ask the question, what's the right way to live? How ought I live? The answer is couched in terms of doing that which is good. That which is good is another way of saying, do what makes you flourish. And of course, there are different ideas about what it is that one should engage in order to be good or in order to flourish. So flourishing is foundational for determining what you ought to do according to the ancient Greeks. This is very different from the other normative ethical theories that we'll look at, namely Kantianism and utilitarianism, both of which assert that if you want to figure out whether or not you're good, then you should behave in accordance with what is right, and then their theories lay out what is right. All right, so with that brief preface, I'm just going to jump into this. And the first thing I'd like you to know is that the place to read is the Nicomachean Ethics, books 1 and 2 of the 10 that actually comprise the entirety of the Nicomachean Ethics. And those two books are available online. And if you're watching this through one of my courses, then you will have a link to that in the internet archives. Okay, so what's the task? So from this frame forward, what I'm going to be doing is just trying to articulate what it is that Aristotle is up to, and then help us, of course, to appreciate what it is that his project was. So the task is to state the necessary and sufficient conditions of a flourishing human existence. And I'm assuming that that language, necessary and sufficient conditions, sounds pretty abstract initially. And so in the early part here, I'm going to try to demystify that and make it more accessible. So to say that something is necessary is to say that if you don't have that particular condition, then you wouldn't be flourishing. What I mean is that it's a condition for counting yourself as being an actual flourishing human being. So there are a number of these things that are necessary. And if you claim that your list, which should include your reasons for having included each item, is such that if and only if all items included in it are present, then and only then is a person eudaimon, or fully flourishing as a human being. So that is to say that to state the necessary and sufficient conditions for the concept at hand, whatever it is to give an analysis of that concept. Okay, still pretty abstract sounding. So let's try an analogy to make it a little bit more manageable. Okay, so let's use the analogy of a square. Suppose you begin by stating that a square has 4 sides, that having exactly 4 sides is a necessary condition for being a square. That sounds right. So that's pretty reasonable. That's a good starting point, right? You say, well, I know this much, that if it's a square, it's necessary that it has 4 sides. But is that sufficient? In other words, is that the only thing you need for something to be a square? Well, consider this. That has 4 sides. If you just accept my crude drawing, right? It's got 4 sides, but it's certainly not a square, right? So even though I've stated a sufficient condition for what constitutes, I'm sorry, a necessary condition for what constitutes a square, that is not sufficient. Something else has to be said, right? So it's also necessary, if something is a square, not only that it has four sides, but also that it's a closed figure. So if we add closed figure as necessary, in addition to four sides being necessary, do we guarantee that all and only squares will be the result? In other words, are those two conditions enough to isolate and separate out what a square is from other kinds of things? Well, consider that this meets our two criteria above, but it's not a square, right? So here we, of course, have a rectangle. So I've not yet provided a complete analysis of a square. There are some things that are closed figures with four sides. So I need to add a third condition, that the sides have to be of equal length, right? That's the problem, that's what enabled the rectangle to get in, is that the sides were of different lengths. So suppose I now say that a square is a four-sided, that was our first criterion, closed figure, that was our second criterion, with sides of equal length. I now have three necessary conditions for what makes a square a square. Will this enable me to keep all non-square things out? If not, then I have not yet stated all conditions that make a square a square. My list is insufficient, right? These things are all necessary, but that's not enough. I need something else to keep other things out, perhaps. Okay, so consider, this guy, right? What's that? This rhombus is a closed figure with four sides of equal length, but clearly it's not a square. So I need to add yet another condition. So another necessary condition, if something is a square, is that the angles have to meet at 90 degrees on the corners of it. So it's necessary for a square to have four sides. It's necessary for a square to be a closed figure. It's necessary for a square to have sides of equal length, but it's also necessary for all of the angles of the object to be at 90 degrees. So the red staircase drawing I made, the long red rectangle, and the purple rhombus all demonstrate that while the above conditions are all necessary for something to be a square, they're not enough. They're not sufficient. It's not until we add the condition that the angles are all at 90 degrees that we ensure that somebody will not mistake a rhombus for a square. Okay, so our drawings illustrated our counter examples. The squiggly line, the rectangle, and the rhombus were all counter examples that showed us that we had not yet analyzed exactly what a square is, because we hadn't stated, while we had stated necessary conditions, we had not stated all of them so that collectively they were sufficient to guarantee that all and only squares would be included. So finally, a square is a four-sided closed figure with sides of equal length, the angles of which are all at 90 degrees. So now the idea is we're just going to do the same thing, the same procedure. We're going to analyze, but this time the concept that we're analyzing is eudaimonia. So similarly to the square example, Aristotle states what he thinks are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a flourishing human existence, eudaimonia, in books 1 and 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. This means that he takes himself to give an analysis of eudaimonia. Notice what an analysis does. In other words, why in the world are we even concerned to do this? Well, first of all, it makes publicly available for scrutiny, which is a trademark quality of philosophy. So when we read and argue with Aristotle, we are critically comparing our own conception of a good life with his. Presumably, we are each living or trying to live a good life, and we are free to become the next voice in the great conversation, which is a name sometimes used to describe the ongoing philosophical activity that you and I are engaged in as we go through this course, right? So the idea is that Aristotle has gifted us with his picture, and we are free to be critical of it, to counter-argue from, certain conditions that he includes, but at least he's taken the time to actually articulate his own view of what human flourishing consists of. And notice that he does it by means of argumentation. In other words, it's not bare assertion. Bertrand Russell once quoted somebody who said that bare assertion has all the advantages of theft over honest toil, right? So in other words, it's not just a matter of saying, well, I feel like this should be included or that, or I really am into this, or I desire that a lot, so I want that to be a part of my life. The philosopher answers the question, why? Why? And so if you read through Nicomachean Ethics books 1 and 2, you'll see Aristotle attempting to make sense of his vision of what eudaimonia or human flourishing consists of. Let's try an analogy. Okay, so the analogy we'll use is of an oak tree. I'm sorry, it's not just an analogy, but it also brings out the fact that, like the oak tree, we are living organisms. And so as living organisms, it's significant that there's a process involved that brings about the flourishing of that kind of organism. So Aristotle held that each living organism has a telos. A telos means a final developed state, which would be ideal if it were reached. But notice that if you begin, in the case of an oak tree, with an acorn, and you ask yourself the question, what is it that would count for this acorn to fully flourish? The answer is that it would have to meet all kinds of conditions. So it has to pass through. The acorn has to escape the squirrels. It has to be in certain weather conditions and so forth, right? So there's the fact that it's an acorn, but then there's also all these developmental conditions which have to be met if it's going to fully flourish. And the idea is that the same thing is true with a human being. So it can't develop if it's planted in the sand, for example. It requires the appropriate quantity of sunlight, water, nutrients, enough time, and so forth, right? And so very few acorns are able to wind up becoming or realizing their potential. They can't do that unless they meet all these conditions. So empirical investigation, right? Looking around at acorns and watching the development of an acorn into a mighty oak tree is something that we can do. And if we do that for, if we are willing to do that for a certain kind of tree, all the more so, Aristotle thinks, is it reasonable for us to give an account of what constitutes our coming to flourish. So empirical investigation can enable us to assess all of these conditions and state them. They can then be used to cultivate and nurture acorns to give them the greatest chance of becoming mighty oak trees. The same thing is true with us. Just as with acorns, very few, if any of us, embody the ideal, but knowing why we are doing what we are doing can at least render our decisions about how to act rational. This is why we are doing philosophy, and why it's worthwhile to do it. In other words, the idea is, you still might say, okay, well, why do I need to actually say all this? Why do I need to know all this? Well, it's because if you have explicitly articulated your own conception of what constitutes a flourishing human life, then you will be able to draw on those principles in those instances where you have to determine the right way to act, right? You want to act in such a way that you actually help to bring about your own flourishing. So the first condition, so remember the squiggly line for the square? The first condition for virtue, or arete, is the first condition for eudaimonia is to have a disposition towards virtue or arete. So if you're confronted with a situation that requires courage, self-control, wisdom, patience, justice, and so forth, an excellent, flourishing human being will be disposed to act in accordance with virtue, right? So virtue enters at the very gate for Aristotle. Well, what exactly do we mean by a virtue? And Aristotle's definition, kind of summed up from various ways in which he states it in books 1 and 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, is that a virtue is a mean between two extremes, each characterizable as a vice. One is an excess and the other is a deficiency. So a virtue is a mean, a middle ground between two extremes, one of which is an excess, one of which is a deficiency relative to a person and a person's circumstances. Okay, now we're going to break this down, but I just remembered I didn't include this in the slides. Some people mistakenly think that what Aristotle is saying is that we ought to be easygoing, right? Take the path of least resistance. And actually, it turns out that's not what he means. So for example, if there was a situation in which, let's say a family member was being abused, and you thought, well, I'm going to be like Aristotle, I'm just going to be cool about what's going on. Aristotle would say you're actually deficient in exercising a certain passion at that juncture. So in other words, there are occasions, there are circumstances in which if you don't exhibit a certain kind of outrage, then that would be inappropriate. So don't confuse with what we're going to talk about here and what Aristotle says. Don't confuse it with the idea that we just always want to be cool, right? Sometimes it's not appropriate to be cool if you're virtuous. So let's think this through bit by bit. So the first part of the definition of virtue is this. It's a mean between two extremes. One's an excess and the other is a deficiency. So notice that we often think of an excellence of character. So a virtue is an excellence of character: courage, justice, self-control, wisdom, characteristics like that. We often think of it as being opposed to one of two extremes to which it's actually opposed. And for example, we're probably more inclined to oppose being a coward to being courageous, right? So it's good to be courageous, but we think, yeah, the fear is that we might not be up to the task and we're just going to chicken out. So we naturally think of the vice, Aristotle says, to which we are most prone. So cowardice is a deficiency, but notice that foolhardiness is also opposed to courage. So you might know somebody for whom this excess is the challenge. So if somebody says, I'm going to take my pocket knife and go to Moscow and show that Putin what's what, right? Well, that would be that would outwardly sort of superficially resemble courage, but it wouldn't be courageous. It would just, given the circumstances, trying to get Putin with a pocket knife. Good luck with that, right? So so that would be an excess of the general idea of courage. So we have on the one hand the deficiency, being a coward, and then on the other hand we have the excess, which would be foolhardy. Okay, I'm giving it a name. I think Aristotle says it doesn't have a name, but that seems to fit the case here. Okay, so all virtues are actually opposed to two vices, although some are so strongly and regularly opposed in only one direction that there may not even be a name for one of the extremes. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, we just don't name it because we're so prone to the one vice. So also now let's look and see that part of the definition of what a virtue is to say that it's relative to a person. So what counts as an excellence in one person isn't necessarily going to be the same for another person. Please note that this is not cultural normative or meta-ethical relativism. It's easy to get these two concepts confused because here we have that word relative again. This is relative in its more neutral sense, right? So like, for example, I'm tall relative to the general population. I'm about 6'3" or 6'4". So I'm tall relative to the general population, but relative to the NBA, I'm not that tall. In fact, I'm kind of short, right? So it's relative in that sense, where it's actually measurable without it's being applicable in such a way that you can justify certain kinds of actions by group membership, etc. Okay, so the example that Aristotle uses is not the best in 2023 and forward, since I hope to use this video for a couple of years. But the example that he uses, just for the record, is Milo. Milo, it was a champion wrestler, and so it was appropriate for Milo to eat a lot of meat. So if you or I were to eat the same quantity of meat as Milo, or any at all, if you happen to be vegan or vegetarian, we would be behaving viciously. But on the other hand, for Milo not to eat a particular quantity of meat would be vicious, right? For him not to eat that particular quantity of meat. So it's relative to the person, and as we'll see in a moment, to the person's circumstances. In his case, the circumstances are that he's a champion wrestler and he needs that strength. So notice again that virtue, or arete, is very wide for the Greeks. It's anything that is part of producing excellence. So, and it doesn't even just apply to human beings, this term virtue. So it's not a goody two-shoes notion, as I mentioned elsewhere in our course, right? It's anything that is part of producing excellence, whether it's in health, shoes, ships, society, persons, etc. In keeping with this, you could say that a sick person was deficient with respect to the virtue of health. So this is different from the way in which we use the word virtue, right? So we wouldn't say of a sick person, well, you're not very virtuous because you're not healthy. But for the Greeks, that made total sense because there was some deficiency with respect to a certain quality that would be ideally possessed by a human being. Okay, so virtue is a mean between two extremes, one in excess, one in deficiency, both characterizable as vices relative to a person, and now relative to a person's circumstances. So this is the last bit. Again, don't confuse this with relativism as an entire theory. Here's a pretty clear example that shows that one course of action is virtuous for one person, but not for another. So if two 9-year-old children are having a scuffle on a playground, there's your circumstance. For a 5-year-old, it would be foolhardy. It would be vicious to directly intervene. However, if I did not intervene, the very same course of, in this case, inaction as taken by a 5-year-old would probably be counted as either the vice of cowardice or at least of apathy or inappropriate indifference on the part of me, right? So the person's circumstances, so the circumstances are this playground scuffle and me, my person. So coming together, if I did what would have been foolish for the 5-year-old to do, I would be much more likely to be exercising a virtue, right? So perhaps courage, or maybe just appropriate concern for social well-being and justice. So, I go up to the 2 and I go, hey, you 2 need to stop behaving this way. And I might, use some gentle coercive tactics to break it up. Now, for me to do that would be virtuous. For the 5-year-old to do that would be a vice, right? It would be vicious because of the person and the circumstances. The kids are likely to impose upon the 5-year-old in a negative way. Okay, I hope that's clear. You can pause it and reread the screen. If it's not, I'd like to get through this. So how do we acquire this disposition, right? So remember earlier, we said you had to be, that virtue is a disposition. You have to be disposed. If you're a flourishing human being, if you're eudaimon, the first condition is that you have to be disposed towards virtuous behavior that we've now defined. Well, this kind of disposition comes through, excuse me, habituation, not through precept. So if you think about common behavior, which is where an adult yells or commands or orders a child what to do, versus literally moving or acting, including speech, gesturing, and associating in ways in which you'd like the child to move, act, gesture, and associate. So think of the contrast between these. First of all, I'm sure everybody, at least on television or the internet, everybody's seen adults futilely yelling at their children and telling them verbally what to do, trying to teach them by precept what correct behavior is like. And it escalates. It escalates because the child is not susceptible to precept in childhood, right? And so Aristotle, 2,500 years ago, he lived from 384 to 322 BCE, already saw that this is not how moral education occurs, right? Morality is ultimately about the actions and that we perform and the intentions with which we perform those actions. So when a child is young, the way the parent, according to Aristotle, actually ought to educate the child with respect to action is not by precept, but by example. So sometimes I think of this as the guardians of children actually acting as fences, right? So let them get about their business, but then also the adult is to be on the perimeter to make sure that no kind of harm comes to the child. And so this kind of modeling of good behavior is the way that virtues are produced, according to Aristotle. It doesn't come through precept, doesn't work. In other words, I think Aristotle, if he were to look around today and see some of the misguided efforts to train children by way of precept, it's not to say that that isn't important. It's just that the kind of habituation into having the right response to courageous actions, to actions that exhibit love and care, are going to come about primarily through example. So the Nicomachean ethics, incidentally, is actually designed for those who already are virtuous. You don't learn how to be good by reading about it. Instead, you now, what we're doing here, presumably, and this is what Aristotle explicitly told his audience, is that we have come together, we the virtuous, the basically good folks, not perfect, but good people. We're here to now give a philosophical account for how we turned out to be basically, good people. And then as he's giving his account, these are all the material that you're reading, if you are reading the Nicomachean Ethics, is just his lecture notes. And so he's articulating it so that we have a written record of what goes on in the life of a fully flourishing human being, or at least somebody who wants to be fully flourishing. And that includes presumably just about everybody, but actually engaging in philosophical discussion about what it consists of is a discipline that not everybody can manage for a variety of reasons. But just as it would be important for a scientist to record all of the elements that go into ensuring that an oak tree becomes a fully flourishing one, so Aristotle thought, it's the same sort of thing. It's almost like a science of human development. We want to keep a record of this so that it can be passed on. Okay, probably enough said about that. Now, necessary condition number 2, I'm going to try to go a little bit more quickly here. It's taking quite a bit of time. You must exercise or act on your virtuous disposition. So it's not enough to be virtuously disposed, right? A flourishing human being actually acts in accord with their virtuous disposition. So this is actually one way in which Aristotle disagreed with Plato. So you've read about Plato, presumably, and his picture of the ideal state where you have guardians who are disposed towards wisdom, soldiers who are courageous, everybody in society exercises self-control, and the result of that is supposed to be justice. And then Plato just kind of assumed that if you had this disposition, you would act in accordance with it. But then Aristotle says, no, we can't settle for just being good inside, like, having good intentions. But if we're really going to give an account of a flourishing human existence, you have to have opportunities. You can't be, let's say that you were, you possess wisdom, courage, self-control, and justice, but you found yourself on an island, a deserted island. You would lack the opportunity to flourish as a human being. So we are intrinsically social beings, and therefore we require more things than just dispositions. And those conditions are social in nature, they're physical in nature, and without them, we cannot be said to be flourishing human beings. So there's more to virtue for the Aristotelian and for the Greeks more generally. There's more to virtue than just your internal intentional states, right? It also intrinsically must include opportunities of a fairly wide variety if you're truly flourishing. You have to be able to exhibit justice. You have to be able to exhibit courage, self-control. You have to be able to exhibit the virtues of friendship and love and caring and kindness and so forth. Okay, necessary condition number 3, So the first one was a disposition towards virtue. The second one was opportunity, the actual exercising of the good disposition that you possess. So now number 3 is knowing that what you are doing is virtuous. In other words, you can't sort of stumble upon virtue, right? So if you accidentally do something that's good, that is not a sign that you're a good person. You're not even flourishing as a human being, even if it's just a matter of luck. So here's a quick story. Imagine that you're invited into the Oval Office, or to depersonalize it, we'll say Carlos. Carlos gets a meeting with the president. He goes in, he sees the red button. The red button is a toggle button that enables the president of the United States. You have to suspend your disbelief here. It enables the president of the United States to push the red button, and then nuclear weapons are launched at, let's say, North Korea, and the beginning of World War III will take place if the president decides to do this. Okay, so now you come into the Oval Office, you meet the president excuses himself, at least as of this recording, it's a him, excuses himself for a moment, and you see the red button, and you, being a curious George, have always wondered about that red button, like what happens when you press it. So you go over and you press the red button. Okay. Now, what you don't know is that before the president left, he had hit the red button, and the red button is a toggle. And so what the president had just done was initiated a launch of nuclear weapons. What you just did is by turning it off, you averted World War III. Now, under one description, if you just averted World War III by pressing that red button for the second time, you just did or performed the best action that any human being has ever performed, right? You stopped the World War. You get absolutely no credit as being in terms of your flourishing as a human being, for having done that. Why? Because you didn't do the good action knowing that it was the good thing to do. So knowledge plays a crucial role in human flourishing. Okay, I think that's pretty clear. So necessary condition number 4, when you perform the good action, knowing that it's a good action and being disposed towards performing such actions, you have to experience the pleasure that's appropriate to the exercising of virtue. It's kind of a weird one, right? And at least initially. So pleasure is definitely a part of the good life, as Aristotle understands it. In fact, if you don't experience pleasure when you do something that is good or virtuous, this is an indication that you do not possess a virtuous disposition. In other words, if something is a matter of habit, think about that. If something is a habit, part of the reason that it's or I'm not sure how to put this, so I'll try it a couple different ways. You do it because you think that by doing it, you will experience a certain kind of pleasure that's appropriate just to the exercising of that habit itself. So think of a bad habit, right? You engage in it thinking, well, I'm going to experience a certain kind of pleasure, like let's say it's smoking, or something like that. God forbid drinking, like where it's a habit and you want to experience that pleasure. That in the same way, performing virtuous actions is supposed to produce a pleasure. So when you help somebody, or when you act in a courageous way, or when you are kind to somebody, yeah, you're going to experience a pleasure. And if you don't, then you're mishabituated, if you will. Notice that also that the reason it's part of human flourishing to experience that pleasure, and for the other conditions, remember all the other conditions 1 through 3 have to be met as well, then you can be relied upon to act virtuously. Whereas if you don't have this disposition and experience this pleasure, it's kind of iffy, right? Like whether on one occasion you're actually going to follow through. So we all know that ideal of like a good person who you can rely upon. Yeah, they do it cheerfully, they do the right thing, they volunteer their time or whatever it might be. And so that reliability factor is a part of human flourishing. Keep in mind again that we are social beings. So this, however, does raise a question for some people. If you're supposed to experience pleasure for doing the right thing, then do I act virtuously because it's right to do so, or because I will enjoy that pleasure? Is that pleasure really the motivating factor? And so we can think back to things like self-interest. There are also hedonic theories of behavior that we don't really directly explore in this course. But that is a question that does arise. And the answer for Aristotle is both. The question is, in other words, a false dilemma. So if somebody goes, yeah, but like, did you really do that because you wanted to be a good guy and help me out? Or did you do it because it would make you feel good? Aristotle says, look, there's no contradiction involved here. I did it for both reasons, right? Think of, I like to think of the example, I like to play basketball. So I like to take that example, right? And go, did you work out, did you play basketball because you knew that it was going to contribute to your physical health? Or did you do it just because like you really like to play, you really enjoy playing basketball? See, that sounds kind of silly, right? It's like, no, I did it for both reasons. I did it, I knew that it was going to induce my health, it was going to contribute to my well-being, but I also did it because I really enjoy it. Okay, so that is the idea here, that in a flourishing human existence, both things are true. I just think that's wonderful, because too often we think, doing the right thing is hard. And Aristotle says, no, it shouldn't be hard. It should be a matter of habit. That's part of what it is to flourish as a human being. We're social beings. You volunteer and you feel good about that. You don't feel good about it because you're a good person. I mean, you do feel good about it because you're a good person, but you also feel good about it because it's just a good thing to do, right? There's no contradiction. You see, I get a little excited about this. So then I forgot that I added this, but maybe this is why making love as appeared to mere self-gratification is so fulfilling, right? I mean, that's a weird example. I guess I wrote this at about 3 in the morning when I was very sleepy, but think about that, right? I mean, you're actually pleasing another person, but then you feel good as a result of that as well. There's no contradiction. Okay. So that's a necessary condition for full human flourishing on the Aristotelian account. And then here comes the rub. In addition to 1 through 4, these are also individually necessary and jointly sufficient if one is to be eudaimon. So in other words, you need 1, 2, 3, and 4 that we've already gone over, but you also need 5, and 5 is a stack set as well. And if you're lacking any of these, then you don't meet the condition of 5. And so if you don't meet the condition of 5, you're not going to be eudaimon. So I almost said you're not going to be the perfect square, which is a double meaning. If you think about that, it's kind of cool. A perfect square, meaning like just a goody two shoes to bring us full circle. So get it again, right? You need 1 through 5, but 5 consists of many parts. And if you don't have some of the things included in 5, which you're about to see, then you can't be eudaimon. All right. And this is where virtually all of us fall short. And some people think Aristotle's requiring too much, or else he's just wrong about these things. So I'll try to make sense of it, right? So if you're going to fully flourish as a human being, then you have to be born into a good family, right? People who understand how to raise children and so forth. You have to have luck. You have to have opportunities. So luck does play a role. Notice that these are external goods. In other words, we don't have control over these things. Some actually we do to a certain extent, but luck is luck, right? By definition, it's something over which we don't have control. We can, of course, create opportunities for ourselves. Wealth, well, you could be born into it, but you could also create it. Physical health and beauty. Whoa, whoa, whoa. If we're talking about a theory that says that whether or not something is right, it's depending upon whether or not it's good, and then you build into that picture of what is good superficial things like physical beauty, that seems to be problematic, right? Well, I'm going to try to explain briefly why maybe that's a mistake. So let me actually get rid of that last one for a second. So let's say that let's say that it's Beyonce, right? So Beyonce, I don't know anything about her family background, but she's created opportunities, she's wealthy, she's beautiful. And so the question, and I don't have this in a slide, so I'll just articulate it. The question is, ask yourself, would I be able to flourish even more so if I had each of these characteristics, given that I also have 1 through 4? So if I'm a good person by disposition and I act in accordance with my my virtuous disposition, and I do so knowingly, and when I so act, I experience the pleasure that's appropriate to the exercising of virtue. Now, if all of those are held constant, so in other words, don't think of money as corrupting or physical beauty as contributing to the propensity towards vanity, right? We know, some people can be egotistical about their good looks. But the idea here is that if I have 1 through 4, then possessing these things, all other things being equal, can only add to my flourishing, right? So let's say Beyonce has 1 through 4 and these things. Well, then she's going to be able to give money to good causes. People are going to listen to her. She's a virtuous person. Let's assume, I don't really know that much about her, but let's say she is. Then, it's as though we want to say more power to you, right? And more power to the person who is a good person and who also has these external goods, because they are going to, as intrinsically social beings, they are going to create an environment that is even better than it would be if they lack these things, right? So if you have a really good person, but who's poor and not attractive, nobody listens to them, well, it's kind of like the amount of virtue or goodness in the world is diminished in proportion to they lack to the to the degree to which they lack those goods, right? Okay, well, I'm really interested in getting your feedback on this picture and what you think of flourishing human existence looks like. So what I'm going to do is invite you to think about that. Notice, just for closure here, that even events that occur after your death can affect your status as having lived a full human existence. So your children's behavior can tarnish your reputation, as we all know is a possibility. And even that, Aristotle takes full on, and he says, look, life is tragic. Most acorns probably get eaten by squirrels. Most people, even if they do develop, like most oak trees, that grow in the right environment, they're not going to be that ultimate oak tree. And you might say, okay, well, look, like if nobody can meet these standards, why even paint the picture? And the response I think that Aristotle would give is, well, look, you can understand why it is that you have the emotions you have on certain occasions. Like, for example, if you're not a vain person, but you're a good person, but you don't think you're really good looking, put myself in that category, then if you feel sad about that, then you might ask yourself, well, why do I wish I had more money and I was better looking? Well, because I'd like to do more things for people, and I'd like people to pay more attention to me because I genuinely have, good things to say. And let's suppose I really did. Then that explains the feeling of sadness that you might experience, that you lack wealth or opportunity or good looks, right? In other words, it shows that we do implicitly value those things, that we somehow, it registers with us that is our picture of human flourishing. So Aristotle, in a sense, is saying, this is what I think it consists of, and I'm betting that you do too. And if I'm wrong, show me why I'm wrong. That's the nature of philosophical activity, but do so by means of an argument. Okay, so notice that any emotions you may experience, if you lack one or more of these, can be explained in terms of the fact that you do find them significant. And there is my thriving Eucalyptus polyanthemus, which means many flowered. Eucalyptus actually means well covered, and then polyanthemus means many flowered, and that is my thriving eucalyptus tree. All right, thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing what you think human flourishing looks like.